Smart.
Yay.
All right. Well, good morning again, and thanks, everyone. As I said at the end of last week, Chris and I were the last two in the room, and we were reflecting on sort of the meta story of now, in particular in relation to democracy in crisis and the work we've been doing as a cohort, and that has expanded into the larger community through Janet, Robin, and Pastor Brian and others. And I heard in that room the first 2 weeks and last night as well, this really burning desire to sort of understand how to talk about the situation that we're in. And so I'm working on a story about how to do that. And it came about mostly through that dynamic, and then partly through a different group, the Earth Bill Network Faith Group. And Pastor Terry Ellen, who is a Unitarian, pointed us to some articles by a person I'd never heard of. His name is Andy Schmookler. And Andy is an author, and I would call him a certified super genius. He's someone who graduated at the top of his class at Harvard way back in 1970. And like a lot of very intelligent people in that genre, that particular type of intelligence, he's a pattern seeker. And he sees deep patterns and wants to try to understand and explain sort of these overarching forces that shape, large things like humanity and culture and civilization. So anyway, I'm going to start my story with a remembrance from about 25 years ago at my old law firm, Davis Wright Tremaine. And I was sitting in our big conference room on the 23rd floor, and we were gathering together for a lunch meeting with some outside people. Didn't really know much about them. There were some lawyers, there were some policy analysts, I think there were some economists, but basically they were there to present some ideas, and I can't even remember the details of it, but it was essentially, we have these ideas about some sort of tax reform and legal reform that would be really super advantageous to people who are wealthy, people who own property, people who are already highly privileged in our culture. And we see political paths forward for implementing these things and for making, your clients even richer than they already are and gaining more power than they already have. And they presented this as if it was a wonderful idea. And of course we would all want to do this. And this is the way the world works. And my immediate reaction to this was, man, that's a horrible idea. And this just seems like an awful thing to do. And I like, do I really belong here in this room? What am I doing here with these people thinking about these ideas? And I don't know if I was the only one that had that reaction, but it's a reaction that stuck with me because my visceral bodily reaction to it was, for lack of a better word, evil. And so I sort of struggled with that. And, I think we all struggle with that in the sense that, are these people evil? Or is this idea evil? Or is it just simply, some sort of political disagreement about how the world should work and how the world does work and how we use power and how these forces come together? Well, with the benefit of Brian and Robin and Janet, one of the quotes that came out of last night's thing from Brian actually was just telling for me, which is, we don't quite know what's going on. And he said that in the context of, what are the MAGA Republicans and white Christian nationalism, and in my view of how they are connected to QAnon, sort of up to? What's their big picture? What are they doing? What's happening now? And Andy Schmookler, these are essays that I can put in the chat, but I'm trying to cull them down to like 3 or 4 little points. The first one is, he looks at natural selection as a process whereby species are always choosing life. And they do this taking the long view, and they do this in community. So it's not that there aren't predators and prey. It's not that there aren't death and violence happening in natural selection, because that's absolutely part of the way it works. But in the long view, it's an ecosystem positive, life positive process. And you don't look at it at the individual species level, you look at it at the eco-community level. And that these systems work and interact in ways that maintain the viability of the whole. His second thing is that civilizations are defined as a set of species that invent their own way of life outside of that natural process selection. So in other words, they are no longer subject to that natural process of generating long-term life in sort of systemic ways, and they start to move outside of that process, and they can kind of have power over. other species. And the trajectories of civilizations start with organization and cooperation, but they inevitably involve conflict and power over and war. And civilizations ultimately inevitably develop the capacity to destroy themselves. And we've seen that through historic civilizations that have collapsed, and we see it now with our own global civilization that clearly has the power to destroy ourselves because we have thousands of nuclear weapons and we are careening toward climate and ecological disaster. And Andy makes the further point that these patterns of brokenness and civilizational conflict are discernible, they're observable, there's a cause and effect process. And what the last point that he makes that I just want to share briefly is that modern people, postmodern people, are conditioned to reject the idea of supernatural forces. So while in our language and in religion, we might talk about evil and forces of evil, secular folks and postmoderns outside of religious traditions generally look at that and go, that's bunk. There's nothing like that happening. And so in the MAGA Republican world, if you think about it, it is primarily a white Christian nationalist movement. Now, there's not uniformity of religious belief, there's not uniformity of religious practice within that movement, but that movement has no problem whatsoever seeing forces of evil in their opposition. And in fact, they frame their opposition as evil. So the QAnon folks in particular look at the Democratic Party, at mainstream people like us, and say, you're supporting a cabal of pedophilia leaders who are abusing children. You're engaging in election fraud and stealing the election from the rightful winner, Donald Trump. And you're allowing open borders, in a sense, to consolidate your own power by bringing in brown people who will vote Democratic and replace white people who are the rightful heirs of power in America. And those three things for them are absolutely evil, and we're absolutely the devil, and we're absolutely people that they have to violently eradicate from the face of the earth. No joke. And it's come to the point where I saw this thing, and I share it with some hesitation, but I'll share it. I watched the Vice 4-part series on finding QAnon, and one of the tactics of this is truly psychological operations, or psyops. And Michael Flynn is probably either embracing and heading Q, or at least using Q or the ideas of Q to consolidate his own power and to prevent himself from being arrested for all kinds of things that he's done that are illegal. But one of the things that he does is literally use images of the devil over images of Obama and Clinton's and Biden, both explicitly and subliminally in video. So if you're watching video on Facebook or YouTube or someplace, there's subliminal images of those leaders with red face and devil horns. And it's part of this whole idea of this battle of good and evil that we are in, whether we want to be in it or not. And so this really is a scary thing to think about. And again, I think it's interesting because in our meetings in the Democracy in Crisis group, we're trying to figure out how to talk to people that disagree with us. And I just want to get a sense of how hard that is and how programmed and cult-like some of this stuff is. Now, it's not everybody, right? And some people are approachable. But there is this real distinct set of ideas that are incorporating evil on one side. And on the other side, we're kind of in good faith trying to work out our political differences and trying to figure out, well, where are we in disagreement and how can we talk to each other reasonably and how can we solve these disagreements? And I want to posit that while we have our own way of talking about these things, whether we want to be in this or not, we are in this battle over whether we call it evil or whether what Andy Schmookler calls it, he calls it patterns of, let me find the right word here, forces that consistently spread a pattern of brokenness. And again, he sees this arising out of war and conflict that is inevitable as civilizations develop and collide with each other. And in our in the Christian story in particular, I'm beginning to see the Jesus movement as one of the alternatives of responding to this force of brokenness, or this force of evil, if you will. And thinking about the Roman Empire and Jesus and the Jewish community's place within that, they were very much subjects of an evil and broken system. And they were abused, they were marginalized, they were in some ways effectively enslaved. They were forced to pay tribute, they were forced to pay exorbitant taxes. The systems that they knew and that they had developed over centuries prior to Roman occupation were being dismantled. And the choices around that were to sort of cooperate and survive, to resist with violence, because that's usually the thing that happens. And resisting with violence was just, you were going to get wiped out because there's no way you had enough force to do that. And another way that I think Jesus was working on was, how do we create our own community in resistance to this force of evil without becoming totally consumed by it? And so how do we live rightly under this principality and power that is so at odds with our belief systems and our ways of life? And so a lot of Jesus' stories and ministry and actions were around forming communities of care that were independent as much as possible from this Roman domination, and resisted as much as possible the cultural violence and influence of the Roman Empire. So in that sort of basic frame, and again, I know this is a Christian piece, but it's a Jewish community that did this organizing. I see efforts like Eco-Faith Recovery and others organizing these communities of resistance and these communities of care and these communities that offer an alternative, positive vision for where we're going next. And I think one of the ways we need to move forward together that's most important is to unashamedly, unabashedly offer our own better image of what is God's intent for human civilization. And it's not going down the MAGA Republican route. It's what Brian and Janet have been talking about. And I really was fascinated last night by the Lutheran social doctrine of sort of this right hand, left hand, and sinners and saints balance, which recognizes that we're subject to these forces, and recognizes that there's the capacity for sort of positive change in us, and there's the capacity for us to go the wrong way, and we have that choice. And making those choices apparent and being in a community that can discern those choices helps us form ideas about better community, and sharing those broadly, publicly, and again, unashamedly, unabashedly, because we are in this struggle for civilization and for a better civilization. And right now we're trending toward this path of brokenness and this path of really, destructive force that devalues all life. It devalues human life, it devalues animal life, it places accumulation and power over first. And that's not a story that's going to last, and that's not a story that is ultimately compelling to any but a very few people. And so with that, I think I'll stop there, and I need to work on the story a lot to make it shorter, but thanks everybody.